Welcome back to Hardware Unboxed. Today, AMD are officially announcing the Radeon RX 7800 XT and Radeon RX 7700 XT. We have all the details, including specifications, launch date, pricing, and AMD's performance claims, plus some additional details on FSR 3, Anti-Lag Plus, HyperRX, and more. So let's get started. I'll begin with the two new graphics cards, both of which will be available on September 6th. The RX 7800 XT will be priced at $500 US, while the RX 7700 XT will be priced at $450 US, both occupying the mid part of the current market in direct competition with Nvidia's GeForce RTX 4070 and RTX 4060 Ti. These new cards are both based on AMD's RDNA 3 Navi 32 GPU die, which is chiplet based, as you can see from this illustration. It has one GCD in the middle, a smaller GCD than was used with Navi 31, but it's still built on TSMC's N5 node. Flanking this are four MCDs using TSMC N6 process, so from a GPU design perspective, it's most similar to the RX 7900 XTX and 7900 XT than the RX 7600, which used a monolithic Navi 33 die. The specs for both models are seen here. The 7800 XT uses a fully unlocked Navi 32 die with 60 compute units and all four MCDs, offering a 256-bit memory bus and 64 meg of infinity cache. This is paired with 16 gigabytes of GDDR6 memory at 19.5 gigabits per second. Meanwhile, the RX 7700 XT is cut down to 54 compute units, and it has 3 of the 4 MCDs, so a 192-bit memory bus and 48 meg of infinity cache. This allows for a 12GB GDDR6 memory configuration, although it's also clocked a bit lower than the 7800 XT at just 18 gigabits per second. Both cards have a similar game clock, 2171 MHz for the 7700 and 2124 MHz for the 7800, although the rated boost clock for the 7700 is a little higher. Typically, the game clock is a more realistic reflection of in-game clock speeds. In addition to all this, both models support new RDNA 3 features like AV1 video encoding and DisplayPort 2.1. Board power ratings are mid-tier as expected, with the 7800 XT listed at 263 watts, while the 7700 XT is listed at 245 watts. Given that AMD are pitting these models against the 200-watt RTX 4070 and 160-watt RTX 4060 Ti, this suggests inferior efficiency for Navi 32 compared to Nvidia's 8104 and 8106 silicon. Based on specifications and pricing alone, I do have some concerns about the price of the RX 7700 XT. The 7700 XT is 10% cheaper than the 7800 XT for a 10% reduction in compute units. That sounds reasonable. But the memory subsystem has been more significantly reduced. The 7700 XT, with its 192-bit bus and slower memory, ends up with 31% less memory bandwidth than the 7800 XT. So realistically, the performance gap between these two models will be more than 10% in a lot of games. That's certainly what AMD are expecting based on this slide, where the 7800 XT is on average 22% faster than the 7700 XT, albeit across just 4 games. If this is indeed an accurate reflection of performance, the 7800 XT will be around 20% faster for just a 10% price premium, giving the 7800 XT better cost per frame. That's definitely what AMD believe, given their FPS per dollar chart has the 7800 XT ahead of the 7700 model. This looks to be a very similar situation to the 7900 XT versus 7900 XTX, where the XTX was only around 10% more expensive for 20% more performance at launch. We'll have to wait and see where the final performance lies in our testing, but this initial assessment points towards the 7700 XT being dead on arrival, at least in AMD's lineup. AMD's main performance claims for the 7700 XT are visible in this slide compared to the RTX 4060 Ti 16GB from Nvidia. On average across this 19 game configuration sample, AMD has the 7700 XT 12% ahead of the 4060 Ti, although this should be taken with a healthy dose of skepticism given these are first-party benchmarks and AMD hasn't always been super accurate with these this generation. Some of these results are ray trace games, some are rasterization, so if we split those off separately, AMD are claiming a 17% lead in raster, but a 4% deficit in ray tracing. On first glance, this looks reasonable. AMD are pricing this new card 10% below the 4060 Ti 16GB, but 13% ahead of the 4060 Ti 8GB, both of which we believe are awful graphics cards with terrible prices. VRAM capacity also slots basically right in the middle there, offering 4GB more than the anemic 8GB 4060 Ti, but you're also paying a premium for this privilege. Similarly, while it is cheaper than the 16GB model, Nvidia does have the VRAM advantage there. Where AMD might struggle is with the 7700 XT compared to some of their RDNA 2 models which are still available to purchase. The RX 6800 in particular is priced around $430 to $450 US these days, and in our testing the 6800 is about 16% faster than the 4060 Ti in rasterization. This would indicate similar performance to the 7700 XT at a similar or lower price, while also packing more VRAM, 16GB versus 12GB. So that will be a very interesting comparison for our final review to see exactly where price to performance ratios lie, especially if the 7700 XT can't quite reach those initial performance figures that AMD are claiming here. My initial feeling here is the 7700 XT is too expensive and it should be a $400 GPU maximum to fit with the rest of the RDNA 3 lineup and older RDNA 2 models, while also offering strong competition to GeForce competitors. With that pricing, AMD could have claimed a faster GPU with more VRAM at the same price as the RTX 4060 Ti 8GB model, but instead they have chosen to not take any big advantage in the mid-range. The 7800 XT has been pitted against the RTX 4070 in AMD's performance slide, showing a 4% gain on average across these 19 games. This breaks down into a 9% advantage in rasterization and a 6% deficit in ray tracing. This looks a bit more favourable than the 7700 XT, given this is what AMD are offering at a $100 lower price point, and with more VRAM coming in at 16GB versus 12GB for Nvidia's competitor. It should also lead to a larger performance gap compared to the RTX 4060 Ti 16GB at the same price, given in our testing the 4070 is 28% faster than the 4060 Ti, and AMD are claiming a small lead over the 4070. Obviously, a thorn in AMD's side in this sort of price tier will be ray tracing performance, which AMD is suggesting is below that of a 4070, and they didn't even test some of the most intensive RT titles, such as Cyberpunk 2077. Where this model could be shaky is again comparing it to the nearest priced RDNA 2 model, the RX 6800 XT, which is currently available for around $530. Our testing has the RTX 4070 and RX 6800 XT offering similar rasterization performance, and AMD are claiming a 9% raster lead over the 4070. This does point to better cost per frame for the 7800 XT, but it hinges entirely on the gap between it and the 6800 XT. If it's near 10% like what is being suggested here, that does give a reasonable advantage in value to the newer 7800 XT, given it's also slightly cheaper. But if the cards end up more equal, it's not much of a generational uplift at all, so we'll have to see how it all plays out in our comprehensive review. So at least on the graphics card launch side of things, what AMD are showing looks reasonable, not super amazing must-buys, not awfully inadequate models, but okay. Again, I think the 7800 XT looks better from what AMD has shown than the 7700 XT, but with both GPUs, it's really going to come down to final performance, features, and value. There's a lot of decent options in this price range these days, including the RX 6800 XT, RX 6800, RX 6700 XT, and probably Nvidia's best RTX 40 series GPU outside the 4090 in the RTX 4070. I guess one thing going for AMD with this launch is they are able to take the crown for the cheapest current generation GPU to offer more than 8GB of VRAM in the 7700 XT, succeeding the RTX 4060 Ti due to its $50 lower price tag and 12GB capacity. AMD also spent some time during their Gamescom presentation talking about new features for Radeon GPUs and games as a whole. One of the biggest ones here is FSR 3, which is hotly anticipated after it was first announced way back in November of 2022. We're nearly 10 months on from that announcement, and despite revisiting FSR 3 at Gamescom, AMD is still not ready to release this feature and haven't put a firm release date on it. The best we could get from AMD is it will be ready in early fall, which I guess means September, but who really knows there. What we also learned is that contrary to recent rumours, AMD are not aiming to have Starfield as their first FSR 3 launch title, and in fact, this presentation gave no indication that FSR 3 would be coming to Bethesda's game at all. Starfield is not listed on AMD's future game support slide, and Bethesda is not listed as a partner for FSR 3. AMD specifically told us that Forspoken and Immortals of Avium would be the first games to receive FSR 3. That's a bit of a blow given that Starfield is AMD's flagship sponsored game at the moment. However, FSR 3 is coming to Cyberpunk 2077, which is good to see given the imminent launch of that game's expansion, Phantom Liberty. We didn't learn all that much more about FSR 3 that AMD hadn't claimed previously. Their demonstrations show frame generation technology working as expected to roughly double the frame rate, which is what AMD claimed it would do last year. Like with DLSS 3 frame generation, you don't get exactly double the FPS as is seen in this comparison, but AMD is showing a significant leap in smoothness when it's enabled. AMD are branding their frame generation tech as fluid motion frames, and when implemented in FSR 3, it uses frame interpolation as well as motion vectors to generate these additional frames, so pretty similar to DLSS 3 by the sounds of things. Where FSR 3 will differ to DLSS 3 is in hardware support. FSR 3 will be available for most graphics cards, though when we asked AMD they said support goes back to RDNA 1 based GPUs, as well as a broad range of competitor solutions including Nvidia GeForce RTX 20, 30 and 40 series graphics cards. They also said that they recommend using FSR 3 on RDNA 2 or RDNA 3 GPUs, suggesting the tech is optimized for newer architectures and may suffer on those older cards. It's not clear whether FSR 3 will be blocked entirely from running on GPUs that aren't in this supported list, for example the trusty old RX 580. It could be a situation where the architecture of older models doesn't include key functionality that FSR 3 requires. We asked AMD about whether FSR 3 uses FSR 2 for temporal upscaling, or whether the upscaling component has been upgraded. They said that FSR 3 includes the latest version of our temporal upscaling technology, which has been optimized to be fully integrated with the new frame generation technology. However, our main focus with AMD FSR 3 research and development has been on creating high-performance, high-quality frame generation technology that works across a broad range of products. Based on this, it doesn't sound like the temporal upscaler has been upgraded, but it will use the latest version. AMD also told us that they've optimized FSR 3 to reconstruct game UI, saying that UI processing is an integral part of our solution to minimize any impact frame generation can have on it. Alongside FSR 3, AMD will be integrating frame generation into their driver as a standalone fluid motion frames feature. So this is similar to what AMD did with Radeon Super Resolution, bringing FSR 1 into the driver. This will offer broad game compatibility and allow you to use a very rudimentary version of frame generation in any title on your Radeon GPU. This sounds good in theory, and I'm sure there will be many comments being furiously typed about how this will put AMD ahead in the generated frames race, and plenty of fanboy wars will ensue. However, based on what I've seen with DLSS 3 frame generation, game integration and the use of motion vectors is crucial to generating visually decent frames. The frame interpolation component is often the weak link to frame generation, causing blurry, garbled messes every second frame. With DLSS 3, usually only parts of the screen have to rely on interpolation, with the rest being processed primarily thanks to motion vector and game engine data, e.g. shift this entire frame slightly to the left for the next generated frame. With AMD saying that fluid motion frames in the driver is just the motion interpolation component, I mean, of course it is, the driver cannot access data such as motion vectors, I have pretty huge question marks over the visual quality of this feature. Without that crucial motion data, is the entire frame just going to be a blurry, smeared mess that's blending two entire frames together? If it's anything like what we've seen from interpolation in DLSS 3, but now applied to the entire generated frame every single time, it could look awful, and I'm not sure it's a feature that will be worth using. So that one will require some pretty heavy scrutiny before we get excited about it. On the latency side of things, this is where it gets complicated. You might have spotted on these FSR 3 slides something called Anti-Lag Plus, which is a new feature that's being announced. But this is also separate to FSR 3's built-in latency reducing technology. So to be clear, when you enable FSR 3, it will automatically apply latency reducing tech, but then Radeon owners can apply Anti-Lag Plus on top of this at the driver level. This slide makes it seem like Anti-Lag Plus is part of FSR3, like how Nvidia Reflex is part of the DLSS 3 umbrella and is enabled when frame generation is toggled on, but AMD clarified that this isn't the case, so a bit confusing there. Anti-Lag Plus is a new driver-level latency reducing feature that is available exclusively for RDNA 3 GPUs and presumably anything else moving forward. This will be available alongside the old anti-lag, but it promises some improvements, and AMD explained it to us as follows. AMD Radeon Anti-Lag helps synchronize CPU and GPU processing during gameplay to reduce input latency. Anti-lag synchronization point, however, is placed at a fixed location in the rendering pipeline. AMD Radeon Anti-Lag Plus further reduces latency through intelligent synchronization placement that considers the holistic rendering pipeline. As a result, Anti-Lag Plus can further reduce latency where it matters most. AMD didn't go into specific details, but this seems more akin to Nvidia Reflex than their previous anti-lag technology. Reflex intelligently adjusts to minimize latency in the pipeline, effectively providing the benefits of a dynamic frame cap to always slightly alleviate any GPU bottleneck, which is a proven technique for improving latency. Nvidia's technology is integrated into the games themselves and is said to also include game optimizations. We don't know if Anti-Lag Plus works like this yet, and AMD's implementation does differ in that it's driver side instead of game side, but how they've explained it makes it sound like it's trying to achieve a similar sort of thing. Hopefully it's like Reflex, which is a great technology that works well, and up to this point AMD didn't really have a competitor for it. It's also not fully clear whether Anti-Lag Plus will work across all games or just a selection of titles. AMD confirmed that it isn't integrated into games, but it is a driver profile based thing, and AMD seems to suggest only some titles will support Anti-Lag Plus, so we'll have to see how that all works when it's integrated into the driver. How Anti-Lag, Anti-Lag Plus and FSR3 all intertwine is a bit confusing, especially in relation to how DLSS 3 and Reflex operate on the Nvidia side, so here is my best explanation of how it all works based on what I've been told. AMD's FSR3 frame generation technology has built-in latency-reducing technology that works across all GPUs. Gamers using an RX 7000 series GPU can go into the driver and enable Anti-Lag Plus on top of FSR3's latency-reducing tech in supported titles. Anti-Lag Plus is not enabled by default in FSR3 titles, it's an optional feature that you need to turn on manually in the driver. For owners of older Radeon GPUs, you can apply Anti-Lag, the non-plus version, on top of FSR3's latency-reducing tech instead, again an optional feature. AMD explained to us that the built-in latency reduction technology in AMD FSR3 will provide valuable latency reduction when using FSR3 frame generation, and our in-driver latency reduction solutions are a bonus that stack on top to provide the best possible experience when using FSR3. As for why Anti-Lag Plus is only supported on RDNA 3, AMD provided this explanation. Anti-Lag Plus relies on intellectual property that was introduced with AMD RDNA 3 and is not available on previous generations of hardware. At AMD, we always aim to support previous generations of hardware. While we are investigating the ability to do Anti-Lag Plus in earlier hardware, we cannot commit that this is possible. I would like to know exactly what intellectual property is specific to RDNA 3 that is required for this feature, but that will be to find out later, I guess. For regular FSR2 users, AMD are releasing a new native anti-aliasing mode, which allows you to use FSR2 technology without any upscaling applied. This is effectively what Nvidia are doing with DLAA, so this gives AMD feature parity with Nvidia in games that will integrate this feature. Having this native AA mode will give gamers a higher quality anti-aliasing technique than many games built in TAA solution at some cost to performance, while also featuring FSR's built-in sharpening. A lot of people have been requesting something like this, so AMD are now delivering it. Lastly, we have HyperRX, which is AMD's one-click toggle to apply all of their performance-enhancing features, first announced way back with RDNA 3 last year. This feature is actually ready now and will be available both in some games and as a driver toggle. Essentially, the goal here is that for novice users, you can hit one button to enable features like Radeon Boost, Anti-Lag, Super Resolution, and even fluid motion frames all at the same time. In-game implementations will use FSR when HyperRX is on, while the driver toggle will use Radeon Super Resolution. Gamers can then go in and further customize what features are enabled, so you could turn on HyperRX then, say, disable Boost or RSR if you don't like those features. HyperRX is the first time all of these features can be enabled together. Previously, for example, you couldn't use, say, Boost and Radeon Super Resolution simultaneously. That limitation has been worked around, the caveat being that like Anti-Lag Plus, HyperRX is only supported on RDNA 3 GPUs and newer. AMD offered the same technical reason for why this is the case as with Anti-Lag Plus, which is pretty questionable to me. For most enthusiast gamers, I don't think HyperRX will be a particularly important feature, as you'll probably want to tweak each of AMD's features individually. And AMD did say that this was designed for people that were new to Radeon GPUs. That's it for this one really. As a recap, we have the RX 7800 XT and RX 7700 XT coming on September 6th, priced at $500 and $450 US respectively. AMD FSR 3 is nearly ready and will be debuting in early fall, starting with Forspoken and Immortals of Avium. Anti-Lag Plus, Fluid Motion Frames and HyperRX are all coming to AMD's Radeon drivers shortly as well. So yeah, that's AMD's announcements from Gamescom. Lots of things to be checking out there, of course. We will have graphics card reviews for those two new GPUs coming up on the channel in early September, so stay tuned for that if you're interested to see exactly where these mid-range GPUs fall in the lineup. We'll also be testing FSR 3 as soon as it's available in games, but again, no release date, so we don't have any firm confirmation of that, but at least we know what games it will be integrated into first. And yeah, we'll look to assess all of the other features as they come in. So if you want to subscribe, you'll get a lot of that content when it comes out in your inbox. So yeah, well worth doing. You can also sign up to our Patreon Floatplane accounts if you appreciate our independent testing and analysis on this channel. You'll be supporting us directly. You'll gain access to some cool benefits as well, like our Discord community, monthly live streams, BTS videos, all that sort of thing. So thanks for watching. I'll catch you in the next one.